Hello, my name's Ian Spencer. I'm the priest and warden of Holland House Retreat Centre in Cropthorne, Pershore, in the Diocese of Worcestershire. I'm offering a series of reflections across this period of lockdown and the coronavirus, and this is the first one that I've broadcast onto our YouTube channel, Holland House Retreat Centre, on our YouTube channel. And this is entitled Exodus, Freedom from Lockdown. I was considering the story of Moses and the burning bush and how that might be a way of us to begin to inquire more deeply into the experience of lockdown. There's no doubt that along with the trauma of watching the appalling escalation of suffering as a result of the deaths and illnesses that the coronavirus has brought upon us, there are more subtle sufferings also going on, sufferings of hearts and minds, of our emotions. And I think maybe that the legacy that will continue after the lockdown has been ended is that which continues to cause us to suffer internally in our bodies as well as our emotions and our minds. Because being incarcerated, and for some people that's not been so very bad, for some people including me, I live in a nice place, but nonetheless incarceration in a jeweled cage is still incarceration. And most of us have not really experienced consciously such confinements before, and although some of us have tried various ways to get through it, maybe even some have enjoyed certain quietness that's come about as a result of the lockdown, nonetheless our overall experience, I think, is that of suffering. The story of the Jewish people incarcerated in Egypt, locked down in Egypt over 3,000 years ago, continues even today. That story continues even today to be seared into the Jewish psyche, and I think still informs all of their fears, and rightfully so, because those fears have been tragically realised many times since Moses and the burning bush. That story about Moses and the escape from Egypt is really important for the Jewish people, and I think it's really important for all of us who care to read it, because it seems to me to be as relevant now as it's ever been. That story of Moses, if you'd like to read it, from chapter 3 of Exodus, verse 1 to 14, I won't read it now, but you can read it sort of offline. Chapter 3, verses 1 to 14. That was just the beginning of the Jewish people's march, long march to freedom. And we too, I think, have a long march to freedom. And I'm not only speaking about our current experience of being oppressed by a disease, but actually what the experience of lockdown is more deeply to us. And in fact, as we experience isolation in our lives seem to be put under a kind of a magnifying glass. Things that have been hidden or overlooked or ignored or oppressed perhaps begin to loom large. And that can be a bit unnerving at first to see those. The cracks that we've been paper overing for months or maybe years of our lives begin to appear. And they're always to do with relationships of one kind or another, not just with people, but our attitudes to all sorts of things, including work and rest, to technology or the TV, food and drink, the weather, and our faith perhaps, and indeed ourselves, because all of our relationships begin in here. They all begin internally and flow outward. That's where they start. And we begin to discover in this period of lockdown and this kind of magnifying glass that we've been put under, that we discover we've been in lockdown and stuck in all sorts of ways for most of our lives. We've been stuck in all kinds of unhelpful ideas about this and that, and these ideas make us happy or unhappy. Let's take the weather, for example. So, people talk about the weather being good or bad. Yesterday the sun shone, we got into the garden, the weather was good. Today the wind is cold, the sky is grey. We have to stay inside the house, the weather's bad. Yesterday I was happy, today I'm not so happy. Really? Is that really deeply true? Actually, my happiness or unhappiness regarding the weather is really nothing to do with isobars. And it's got everything to do with my attitude toward the weather, my relationship between the weather and myself. And I can't do anything about the weather, but I can do something about myself. And the fact is that we're suffering all the time from these internal lockdowns, but we just don't know it. We live our entire lives, not just maybe a dozen weeks or so of this particular lockdown. We live our entire lives under all sorts of invisible lockdowns that prevent us from being truly free. And most of these have crept up on us unawares. You know, it's not like there's an announcement beforehand. We just quietly inherit all these lockdowns from all over the place, from our parents, from our siblings and our teachers, from our neighbours, politicians, religious leaders and religions in general maybe, philosophies that we particularly like or don't like, and our cultures, both our local culture, the culture of the village, the town that we're living in, and our national culture. All of these can create locked areas of our lives. One by one, as we experience our life, another wall goes up without us seeing it, and surely incarceration deepens. And don't think that lockdowns are only to do with things and situations we don't like or approve of. Our kind of locked downness is just as effective through the bonds of our pleasures and our likes and our preferences. They're just as strong as their opposites. I think it might be worth, if you want to, you can pause the video for a moment, maybe just 3 minutes, and consider just how this period of lockdown has enlightened you in terms of your difficulties in dealing with the likes and the dislikes that have kind of become quite big, the frustrations that you've had, and your concerns and your anxieties about what it is to be locked down, kind of imprisoned. So you might want to just pause the video for a couple of minutes just to consider those. And now I'm going to offer you a little bit of wisdom from outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition for a moment, and look towards our brothers and sisters from other traditions, and in this case that of yoga. Now, don't turn off the video because I've mentioned yoga. Do please try and stick with it to the end, because I think there's some teaching here and it can be helpful. So in his written account of yoga, Sri Patanjali writes in chapter 2 in verse 3 of his Yoga Sutra, which was written maybe 2,000 odd years ago. He writes, avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha, klesha. Just 6 words. But those 6 words translate as: the sources of affliction are misapprehension, egotism, desire, repulsion and fear. The kleshas literally, that kind of means a source of suffering. No, literally means obstacles, really, obstacles. The kleshas, these obstacles, says Patanjali, are rooted in 5 elements. Our suffering rooted in 5 things. Firstly, poor understanding, avidya, which literally means not seeing. Vidya is to see, avidya is not to see. It's where we get the word video from, a Sanskrit word. So literally not seeing, and it's the cause of all the others, because if we had perfect clarity regarding the truth of our lives, then we wouldn't be bound by self-centeredness, desires, repulsions, and fears. These 5 are the building blocks that create all the walls of our internal lockdowns. They quietly and mostly unconsciously lock us down and out of the freedom for which we're all born, freedom that is our inheritance as children of God. And in the Christian tradition, maybe to use a rather loaded and perhaps sometimes unhelpful word, to be honest, these days, we would call that sin. I would call that sin. Sin, the etymology of sin, the root of the word sin, as we probably already know, is to miss the mark. It's like when you fire an arrow at a target and miss the target. That's the root of the word. So in this context, it simply means that we've not hit the target of our freedom as children of God, because we've been locked down in all of these glaciers. We've been locked down and we feel lost and separated because of the walls of misapprehension, egotism, our desires, our likes and what we prefer, and our repulsions, our hatreds at the worst end of the spectrum, just our general dislike of this and dislike of that, and moaning about this and moaning about that, and our fear. And abinavation means the fear of death. But all fear in the end is a derivative of the fear of death. All our little fears are little deaths when you look at them. And so we suffer in our lockdowns. We suffer, and we contribute to other people's suffering, because oddly enough, we capture them in our lockdowns too. They get stuck in our fears and anxieties and our likes and our dislikes. They get trapped in our likes and trapped in our dislikes. So it prompts the question, how do we hit the mark then? How do we not sin, or how do we sin less? How do we hit the mark more often than not? If we just can't see the mark in the first place, if we suffer from avidya, we're not seeing correctly. How do we begin to see correctly? See, if Moses hadn't have seen correctly, if he hadn't have seen the burning bush properly, if he had just thought it was another brush fire, as was often the case in the hot wilderness, then he would have just walked past and he would have missed that essential opportunity that opened up to him. And if Jesus hadn't seen, and in this sense, I think we could use the word felt, because to see is to use all of our. We don't use our senses to see. We use our minds to see. Our senses all coalesce in our minds. It's our minds that help us to see. And Jesus felt the woman that was suffering from bleeding when all the people crowded in on him, and she just wanted to touch the hem of his coat, because she thought, if I can just touch his coat, I'll be healed. And he felt her touch him. He felt her touch him. That's in Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, 25 to 34. He saw clearly. Nobody else saw. The disciples are going, what do you mean? What do you mean you've been touched? There's loads of people touching you. But he saw. Jesus saw clearly. So the most important thing to remove lockdowns is to learn to see clearly, to recognise the avidya element of our lives. And only then can we begin to recognise all these little walls that have been created by our egos, by our likes and our dislikes, our desires and our repulsions, and our fears. And for Christians, we have the person of Jesus to help us understand what true seeing looks like, what it is to have clarity, because just reading the Gospels about what Jesus did and how he was with people, situations, events, and the things that occurred in his life, we begin to get an insight into what St. Paul calls the mind of Christ. Jesus didn't have any lockdowns. He was as free as the wind that blows, just as he described to Nicodemus. In John's Gospel, chapter 3, verse 8, he is as free as that wind. The wind blows where it will. So it is with people born of the Spirit. And then later on in John's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 31 to 34, Jesus says to those gathered around him, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's a beautiful thing. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But you know, those around him, they didn't consider themselves imprisoned at all. They said, we have never yet been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free? Parenthesis, we're not enslaved. And then Jesus replies, very telling here. Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. See, we're not locked down in the end by anything that's external to us. Our freedom begins and ends in here, on the inside. And not seeing or understanding this is where all our suffering originates. It's where it begins and where it ends. St. Paul has it right when he says to the Galatians, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. That's Galatians chapter 5 verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. The purpose of being set free in Christ is to be free. Isn't that exciting? Isn't that a gift? Isn't that a beautiful thing? To be free. It's our inheritance. It's our inheritance. God's promise to Moses when Moses stood in awe before that bush that would not be consumed by the fire is likewise a promise to all of those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. Maybe one way to read Exodus chapter 3 verse 8 is this, is my take on it at this time. When God says to us, I have come to deliver you from the power of lockdowns, all of them, everything that holds you back, to bring you up out of that place to a good and spacious place, a place where you will be free and utterly at peace. I think this promise is as much for 21st century humans as it was for our brothers and sisters of so long ago, in a different time and a different place. And our experience of the 2020 lockdown because of the coronavirus can be, should we have ears to hear and eyes to see, a teaching that might help deliver us from a life stunted by unconscious lockdowns, so that we might come to a boundless, spacious life, a life as Jesus has promised, lived to the full. May the Lord bless you at this time and free you.